"You have 9 days," the Archon said, and the words fell into the silence of the temple like stones dropped into a well that had no bottom. Corin Vale stood at the edge of the speaking circle, his flight leathers still carrying the dust of the Ashenmere crossing, and tried to make the number mean something. 9 days. He had flown longer supply runs than that. He had weathered longer storms in the saddle. 9 days was nothing. Except it was everything, because in 9 days, the last dragon in the world would die. The Archon, a woman named Thessaly, older than the temple itself seemed, her spine curved beneath the weight of ceremonial robes that no longer fit the body they had been cut for, spread her hands over the speaking stone. The stone was warm. It had been warm for 3,000 years, heated from below by the breath of what slept beneath the temple floor. When the breath stopped, the stone would go cold for the first time since the founding of the Velthari Order, and no one alive knew what to do after that. "The resonance is failing," Thessaly said. Her voice carried the flat precision of someone who had given the same report for weeks and had stopped hoping the numbers would change. "Sorvin's heartfire has been diminishing at a rate of 4% per day for the past month. At current trajectory, total cessation will occur in approximately 9 days, Corin said. She looked at him. Not with irritation. The Archon was past irritation, past urgency, past the administrative panic that had consumed the first 3 weeks of the decline. She was in the territory beyond all of that, the quiet country where people go when the crisis has outlasted their capacity to be frightened by it. "Yes." He looked down through the speaking circle's iron grating. Below, 60 feet down in the cathedral-sized chamber the Order called the Hearthold, he could see the glow. It was the color of late afternoon, amber shot through with filaments of copper and rose, and it pulsed with a rhythm he had known since childhood, since before he could name it, since the first morning his mother had carried him down the pilgrim stairs and held him close to the warmth. The heartfire of a dragon. The last dragon. "Sorvin." "What does she need?" Corin asked. The Archon's expression shifted, a crack in the composure, quickly sealed. "She needs to not be the last. That is the one thing we cannot give her." Corin knew the history. Every writer did. The Velthari Order existed for a single purpose, to tend the dragons of Ashenmere. For 3,000 years, riders had bonded with dragons, flown with them, cared for them, maintained the symbiosis that kept the heartfire burning and the land fertile and the sky alive. The heartfire was not metaphor. Dragons breathed something into the atmosphere that no alchemist had ever been able to name or replicate, a warmth that was also a frequency, a vibration that kept the weather patterns stable and the soil rich and the winds reliable enough for navigation. Without it, the meteorologists said, the continental climate would destabilize within a generation. The farmers said faster. But that was the big picture, the policy argument. Corin did not care about the big picture. He cared about Sorvin. She was 4,000 years old, the eldest surviving dragon by a margin of 2 millennia, since the second eldest, her brother Calethorn, had died 47 years ago in the winter of Corin's birth. Her scales were the deep bronze of old church bells, weathered to a matte finish by centuries of wind and sun, and where the light caught the edges of her plates it showed a patina of verdigris and gold, like something recovered from the ocean floor. Her wings, fully extended, could shadow an entire village, but she had not extended them in 3 years. The joints had calcified. The membrane had thinned. She lay in the Hearthold, a chamber carved from living stone by her own ancestors, its walls scored with the claw marks of every dragon who had ever rested there, and she breathed, and the breathing kept the world alive, and the breathing was slowing. Corin had been her rider for 22 years. The bonding ceremony had been performed when he was 16, the ritual words spoken over the speaking stone while Sorvin's amber eye, larger than his whole body, watched him from below with an expression he had spent 2 decades trying to read. The bond was not telepathy. It was physical. He felt her heartfire in his own chest, a warmth behind his sternum that rose and fell with her breathing, that spiked when she was distressed and steadied when she slept. It was there now, and it was weaker than it had been yesterday, and yesterday it had been weaker than the day before. 9 days. I'm going down, he said. Thessaly nodded. She did not offer advice or caution or the standard reminder about not overexerting the patient. She knew what going down meant. It meant he would not come back up until he had to. The pilgrim stairs were carved into the temple's interior wall, a spiral of worn basalt steps that descended through stone strata laid down before humanity had language. Each step bore a shallow depression from centuries of feet, human feet, always human feet, because the stairs were too narrow for dragons. The dragons had their own way in, through the vast natural shaft that opened onto the valley floor. But that entrance had been sealed 40 years ago when the last dragon who could still use it, Calethorn, dragging his diseased body through the opening with the desperate, clumsy determination of a creature that still believed the sunlight would heal him, had scored the rock with his claws so deeply that the structural engineers had reinforced the tunnel mouth with iron bands. Torchlight was unnecessary. The heartglow from below painted the walls in shifting amber, and Corin descended through it the way a diver descends through warm water, the light thickening around him with each turn. By the 40th step, he could feel the heat on his skin. By the 50th, the air tasted of copper and ozone, the particular taste of dragon breath, which every rider knew the way a sailor knows salt. By the 60th, the warmth had soaked through his flight leathers and into his skin, and the bond in his chest was humming, answering the fire below the way a tuning fork answers a struck note. She was waiting for him. That was the first thing he noticed, that she was awake, which she had not been at this hour for the past week. Her head was lifted, her neck curved in the resting alert posture, her bronze plates catching the heartglow and throwing it back in patterns that shifted with each slow breath. Her eyes amber, the same amber as the heartfire, as if the fire had been poured into her and set to burn behind glass, were fixed on the stairway, tracking his descent with a focus that cost her something. He could feel it through the bond, the effort of attention, the metabolic price of staying present. "You didn't have to wait up," he said. Sorvin's jaw shifted, the draconic equivalent of a tired smile, a rearrangement of the massive plates around her mouth that revealed the very tips of teeth as long as his forearm. Her breath was warm and slow, and carried the faintest scent of the minerals she processed. Iron, sulfur, the deep earth elements that dragons consumed and transmuted into the heartfire that kept the world in balance. "You smell like the Ashenmere crossing," she said. Her voice was not sound, exactly. It was vibration, a resonance that originated in the massive vocal plates at the base of her throat and traveled through the stone floor into the bones of his feet and up through his skeleton until it reached his inner ear. Every rider heard their dragon differently. Corin heard Sorvin as a low contralto, unhurried, with the cadence of someone who had been choosing words carefully for 4,000 years and had gotten very good at it. "Came as fast as I could," he said. He crossed the heart-hold floor, 200 feet of smooth basalt, worn to a polish by millennia of claws, and stopped at the edge of her forelimb, where the massive joint met the shoulder and the scales transitioned from the heavy dorsal plates to the softer ventral tissue. This was their place. 22 years of visits had worn a smooth patch in the stone here, a human-sized hollow where Corin sat and leaned against the warm wall of her body and felt her heartfire pulse through his back. He sat. The warmth enveloped him, not the oppressive heat of a furnace but the deep, even warmth of sun-soaked stone, the kind that seeps in slowly and settles in the marrow. He could feel the heartfire working through the contact, the way it always did, the bond tightening when they were close, the fire in his chest strengthening as if drawing from a deeper well. His body temperature rose by 1/2 degree within minutes. The Order's physicians had measured it years ago, when they were still trying to quantify the bond in clinical terms. They had stopped trying when the numbers refused to behave like numbers. The bond did not obey linear models, did not respond to variables in predictable ways. It was not a mechanism. It was a relationship, and relationships do not fit on charts. The Archon says 9 days, he said. Sorvin's breathing did not change. The massive lungs expanded and contracted with the same deliberate rhythm, each cycle pumping another measure of warmth into the chamber and the stone and the temple above and the earth beyond. But through the bond, Corin felt the truth, a tremor, a flutter, the cardiac equivalent of a caught breath. She is optimistic, Sorvin said. Corin closed his eyes. How long? 7, perhaps 6 if the night is cold. He pressed his back harder against her flank. Tell me what to do. You are doing it. Sitting against your side is not a medical intervention. Sitting against my side is the only thing that has kept my heartfire above critical for the past 3 weeks. The bond works both ways, Corin. When you are close, my fire burns steadier. When you are far as you were, crossing the Ashenmere, it gutters. The Archon's charts show the correlation, though she will not have told you. She believes it would make you feel guilty about sleeping or eating or performing basic biological functions. Corin opened his eyes. The amber glow played across the hearthold ceiling, where the ancient claw marks caught the light and created a shifting constellation of shadows. He had spent 22 years looking at that ceiling. He knew every mark, the broad, confident strokes of the founding dragons, the finer scratches of the later generations, the deep parallel gouges left by Calethorn in the last winter of his life, when the pain had grown too large for silence. Then I won't leave. You will have to. In approximately 4 days, the Archon will inform you that the resonance has reached a critical threshold, and that the Order must prepare for what she will call the transition. She will use that word because it sounds less terrible than what it is. Sorvin's eyes shifted, the amber iris contracting. Corin, I need you to listen carefully because I will only say this once. The formality in her resonance was something he had heard only twice before. Once when she told him the name of the disease that had taken her brother. Once when she told him her true name, the one that existed before the Velthari Order, before the Temple, before humanity had come to Ashenmere and found the dragons already ancient. I'm listening. The heartfire does not end when a dragon dies. It disperses. The warmth that has been contained in my body for 4,000 years will release into the stone, the earth, the water table, and the atmosphere. Uncontrolled dispersal. The alchemists call it a bloom. It is not gentle. It is the equivalent of 4 millennia of stored thermal energy releasing at once, and it will destabilize everything within 200 miles. The temple will not survive. The valley will not survive. The settlements downstream will not survive. Corin's hands had gone still on his knees. Unless, she said. He waited. Unless the dispersal is guided, channeled, shaped by someone who knows the fire's frequency, who carries it in their own body as you do through the bond. A rider can serve as a conduit. The heartfire passes through the bond into the rider, and the rider directs it outward, evenly, slowly, the way a river is released through a dam rather than over it. What happens to the rider? Sorvin did not answer immediately. The silence was not hesitation. It was the silence of a creature who had spent 4,000 years learning how to say difficult things and had never found a way to make this one less difficult. The fire is too much for a human body to contain. The conduit survives the channeling. I would not ask this of you if it were a death sentence, but the fire changes what it passes through. The bond, which has been a whisper between us for 22 years, becomes total. The heartfire writes itself into your tissue. Bone, muscle, marrow. You will carry it, a fraction of it, the fraction a human frame can hold for the rest of your life. The rest disperses safely through you into the atmosphere over the course of hours rather than seconds. What does changes mean specifically? It means you will not be entirely human afterward. The fire leaves marks, physical ones. The riders who did this in the ancient histories, and there were 7, across 3,000 years, reported scales along the forearms and shoulders. Changes in vision, a sensitivity to the heartfire frequency that does not fade. 2 of them could produce a small flame from their hands, though the records suggest this was more alarming than useful. 1 reported hearing the resonance of every dragon within 100 miles, even after the dragons had passed. Corin sat with this. The hearthold hummed around them, the deep, subsonic vibration of Sorvin's heartfire resonating through stone. He had grown up with that sound, the way other children grew up with the sound of a river or a forge. It would stop in 7 days unless he did what she was asking. The other option, he said. The bloom, uncontrolled dispersal. No, the other option. The one where you don't die. The silence this time was warm, and it was sad, and it carried 4,000 years of a creature who had outlived everything she had ever loved and had found. In the last 22 years, one more thing worth loving and was now preparing to leave it. There is no such option, my rider. I am the last. The heartfire was meant to be shared among many, a network, each dragon sustaining the others, each heartfire reinforcing the frequency. When Kael'thorn died, the load doubled onto me. When Aethys died before him and Morwen before her, and Thessine before her, each death increased the burden on the survivors by a fraction that compounded across centuries. I have been carrying the full resonance alone for 47 years. The fire is not killing me. The loneliness of the fire is killing me. A single flame, no matter how strong, cannot sustain a frequency meant for hundreds. Corin pressed his palm flat against her flank. Beneath the heavy plates he could feel the heartfire, a deep, rhythmic pulse that matched the warmth in his own chest. 2 fires beating together. Not enough. Then I'll do it, he said. You understand what I am asking. You are asking me to do the thing I swore to do when I was 16 years old. Tend the fire. That was the oath. The oath did not anticipate this. Every oath anticipates this. That is the point of oaths. They hold when the easy reasons stop working. Sorvin's head lowered until her jaw rested on the stone floor, and her eye, the great amber lens, flecked with copper and gold, larger than a wagon wheel, was level with his face. He could see himself reflected in it, a small figure, dusty, tired, 38 years old, with the calloused hands and wind-burned skin of a man who had spent most of his life in the air. Not a hero, not a chosen one. A rider. 4 days, she said. The Archon will call the transition on the 4th day. You will need to be ready. What do I need to do? Be here. When the fire releases, you must be touching me. The bond channel requires physical contact. The fire will pass through the bond and you will feel everything. Every memory the heartfire has carried. 4,000 years of sky and wind and the voices of dragons you never knew. It will be more than a human mind was built to hold. You must let it pass through you, not hold it. The ones who tried to hold it were the ones who did not survive the aftermath. You said all 7 survived. I said the conduit survives the channeling. I did not say all 7 let the memories pass through. 2 held on. They lived, but they were changed in ways that went beyond the physical. They spent their remaining years hearing voices in the resonance frequency, speaking to dragons who were not there. The fire did not break them. They broke themselves trying to keep what the fire showed them. Corin filed that. Let it pass through, do not hold on. He had spent 22 years learning to let Sorvin's moods wash through the bond without grasping at them. The way a good rider lets the wind pass rather than fighting it. This would be the same skill, raised to an impossible degree. I'll need to tell the Archon, he said. Tell her on the 4th day. If you tell her now, she will spend 3 days searching for an alternative, and there is no alternative, and the searching will exhaust her when she needs her strength for what comes after. What comes after? The order must continue. The dragons are gone, but the heartfire, the fraction you will carry, must be tended, studied, understood, someday perhaps replicated. That is a work of centuries, and it needs the Archon. It needs her clear-eyed and steady, not hollowed out by 3 days of arguing with physics. Corin leaned his head back against the warm bronze. Above them, the claw marks on the ceiling shifted as the heartglow pulsed, the constellation of shadows expanding and contracting with each of Sorvin's breaths, as if the ceiling were breathing too. He watched the marks and tried to imagine the hearthold without the glow that made them visible. He could not. The marks and the light were the same thing, artifacts of presence, meaningless without the fire that cast them. "What do we do with the time we have?" he asked. "The same thing we have always done. You sit, I breathe, we tend the fire." On the second day, Corin flew. Not on Sorvin, she had not been flight capable for years, but on the wind itself, using the harness glider the Order's engineers had built for high-altitude survey work. He launched from the temple spire at dawn, the Ashenmere Valley spreading below him in the clear winter light, and he flew the perimeter of the Hearthold's influence, the invisible boundary where the warmth of Sorvin's heartfire met the cold of the untempered atmosphere. He could feel it through the bond, a line in the air, sharp as a blade, where the world went from alive to merely existing. Beyond the line, the wind was different, not just colder, emptier. The heartfire's frequency carried information that the body processed without conscious thought. The moisture content of the air, the stability of the thermals, the subtle pressure gradients that told a flyer where the lift was and where the shear waited. Beyond the line, all of that went silent. The air was just air. Flying in it felt like reading a book with half the words removed. He traced the line for 3 hours, mapping it, noting where it had retreated since his last survey a month ago. Half a mile on the southern face, where the valley opened to the lowlands. A 1/4 mile on the eastern slope, where the ridge should have blocked the recession but the rock had fractured along a fault line the heartfire had been stabilizing for centuries. Without the frequency dampening the stress, the fault was waking up. Small tremors. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the engineers' reports had taken on the clipped, careful tone of people conveying urgency without causing panic. On the western approach, where the trade road wound up from the coast, the tree line had shifted. Not dramatically, perhaps 200 yards upslope, but the old growth near the heartfire boundary had dropped its leaves early, as if the trees themselves knew the season was changing in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar. A stand of aspen near the ridgeline still held its gold, impossibly late for winter. Morwen's aspens, Corin realized, the grove that had been singing at the heartfire's frequency for centuries. Even now, with the fire guttering, those trees held on. He banked the glider and passed over them, and through the bond he felt something that was not Sorvin, a faint, woody echo of the resonance, embedded in the living wood, still vibrating. Morwen's last song playing on. He landed at the village of Thornwall, at the valley's southern edge, and shared a midday meal with the elder, a woman named Jessra, a farmer with a strong jaw and soil under her nails. She did not know about the 9 days. She knew that her apple trees had not bloomed properly for 3 years, and that the weather witch had shrugged and said something about long cycles. "How is she?" Jessra asked, meaning Sorvin. Everyone in the valley knew the dragon, the way you know a mountain or a river, permanent and defining. "Tired," Corin said. Jessra studied his face for a moment. She had the valley people's gift for reading the space between words, the way a good farmer reads the space between weather and season. Whatever she found in his expression, she did not name it. She poured him cider and asked instead about wind patterns at altitude, and he told her what he had observed, and they sat in the winter sunlight and talked about wind the way people talk about mutual friends. On the way back, he detoured over the eastern ridge and found what he had been hoping not to find. A landslide, small, fresh, a tongue of loose shale peeled away from the ridgeline and spilled across the old pilgrim road. The road had been stable for centuries. The heartfire's frequency had kept the substrate locked. Now the frequency was failing, and the mountain was remembering that it was made of loose stone and gravity. He landed at the temple and reported to Thessaly. She listened, made a note, added it to the growing file of failures, springs drying up, fault tremors, crop anomalies, the navigational drift that had cost a trade caravan 3 days when the wind patterns shifted. Each failure small, each one accelerating. After the transition, she said carefully, choosing the word as though she had not been preparing for it since the decline began, will the fraction he will what remains? She caught herself. Corin let the silence sit. You haven't told me about any transition, she said. I haven't, but you've read the histories, and you've been preparing evacuation routes for the Bloom scenario since the decline started. Something passed between them, the acknowledgement of two people carrying the same terrible knowledge and pretending the other did not share it. Fourth day, she said quietly. We'll talk on the fourth day. He descended the stairs at sunset and Sorvin was asleep. The heartfire was lower. The amber glow had retreated from the far walls of the hearthold, the shadows creeping inward. The claw marks on the ceiling, the founding strokes, the fine scratches, Calethorn's gouges, were fading into darkness at the edges. He sat in his place at her flank and counted her breaths, 712 that night. Each one a measure of warmth pushed into the world, each one smaller than the last. On the third day, Sorvin told him about the others. Calethorn was stubborn, she said. The morning light came through the shaft above the hearthold, a column of gold that fell through 60 feet of stone and hit the chamber floor in a perfect circle. He refused to believe the decline was irreversible. He spent his last century experimenting, trying to modify the heartfire frequency, to make it self-sustaining without the network. He found a harmonic that could sustain itself for approximately 4 minutes before collapsing. He ran the experiment 371 times, and every time the harmonic collapsed at the same point, and every time he was surprised. Corin smiled, because the story was told with the warmth of someone remembering a sibling's most infuriating quality and finding, from the distance of decades, that the infuriation had been love. Ethai's was different. She was practical. She understood before any of us that the network was failing, and she spent her final years documenting everything. The frequency patterns, the resonance structures, the precise calculations of how the heartfire interacted with atmosphere and stone and water table. Her records fill an entire archive beneath this chamber. 700 scrolls, each one measured and annotated in her careful script, each one a piece of the puzzle that might someday allow the heartfire to be rebuilt. If the fraction you carry can ever be amplified, expanded, replicated, it will be because Ethais wrote down how the fire worked while she still had the fire to study. And Morwen. Sorvin's breathing changed, a slight hitch, the draconic equivalent of a caught throat. Morwen sang. She believed the heartfire was not energy but music, that the resonance was a song and the song could be taught. She spent her last 3 centuries singing to the mountains, to the rivers, to the stone. She believed that if she sang long enough, the world itself would learn the frequency and carry it after she was gone. Did it work? You flew over her aspens today. You felt them. Corin's hand paused on her flank. He had not told her about the grove. The bond, she said simply. I felt what you felt, a faint resonance in living wood still singing. That is Morwen's answer 300 years late. Yes, it worked. Not enough to sustain a climate, but enough to prove the principle. The world can learn the song. It simply needs more teachers. And Thessin. Thessin was the quietest. She did not experiment or document or sing. She simply loved. She loved the valley and the people in it, human, dragon, every creature that came within the reach of her fire. She spent her last years walking through the settlements, touching the stone walls, warming them one by one, embedding small pockets of heartfire in the foundation stones the way a gardener plants bulbs, not knowing when they would bloom, or if, but trusting that warmth placed with intention does not simply vanish. Every settlement in the valley with a Thessin stone has a cellar that stays warm through the deepest winter. The builders think it is clever insulation. The dragons knew better. And Vesperax tried to pass the heartfire to the trees, and succeeded only in creating a grove of aspens that turned gold 3 weeks before any other tree in the valley. A failure by her standards. A miracle by anyone else's. Sorvin's plates shifted in what might have been amusement. Drelith the Young lived barely 500 years, but burned so bright that the stones of the eastern ridge still carry a faint warmth. Koreth's Sunkeeper loved the dawn so deeply, he reshaped the heartfire to amplify it, so that morning over Ashenmere lasts 45 minutes instead of 20, a gift the valley still receives without knowing whom to thank. Each of them left something behind, Corin said. Each of them left everything behind. That is what dragons do. We are not good at taking things with us. We are very good at leaving things where they will be found. She paused, and her breathing steadied, as if she were gathering strength for what came next. I want to tell you all their names, she said. Every dragon who carried the heartfire from the first to me. 317 names across 4,000 years. Will you hold them? I thought you said not to hold on. Not to hold the memories. The names are different. Names are not memories, they are seeds. You carry a seed and plant it somewhere and something new grows. Corin shifted against her flank and said, I'm ready. The names came not as words but as resonance, each one a distinct vibration that Corin felt in his chest the way he felt music. Valandries, Thesmorn, Koreth's Sunkeeper, Ashenwild the Quiet, Dreameth of the Copper Line, names that carried weight and weather and the particular quality of light in the century when their bearer had lived. Some were sharp and bright. Some were slow and deep, left by ancient ones who had carried the fire for 1,000 years and whose vibrations still lingered, like a bell struck long ago. He did not try to hold them, he let them pass through, and they settled somewhere below conscious memory. He would not be able to recite them, but they would be there when needed, the way a language learned in childhood is there, not recalled but recognized. It took 3 hours. When Sorvin finished, the hearthold was silent except for her breathing. The last name, Corin said, because he had noticed the absence. My name is for the 4th day, when you are ready to receive it fully. On the 4th day, Corin told the Archon. Thessaly listened without interrupting. She stood at the speaking stone, noticeably cooler now, and held herself very still, the way people hold themselves when the alternative is collapse. There is no other way, she said when he finished. No. She looked at him for a long moment. You were the best writer this order ever produced. Not the most talented, Cale Drennan could outfly you blindfolded. Not the most knowledgeable, half the archivists know more dragon lore. But the best, because you understood what the bond actually is. What is it? A promise. You made a promise to a dragon when you were 16 years old, and you have kept it every day since, and you are going to keep it now, and the keeping is going to cost you everything you were, and you are not hesitating. Corin swallowed. She said to tell you on the 4th day, so you wouldn't waste time arguing. Thessaly's composure cracked, and what came through was not grief but a fierce, exhausted tenderness. She knows me too well. How long does the channeling take? Between 4 and 11 hours, historically, but the historical conduit served dragons of 800 to 2,000 years. Sorvin has been accumulating for 4 millennia. Nothing in the records approaches that. Meaning it could be longer. Meaning I cannot promise you the same outcome. She met his eyes. Sorvin is 4,000 years old and loves you. Those 2 facts may be influencing her assessment of the risks. Then I'll take her word for it. She's never lied to me. That evening, Thessaly convened the order in the great hall above the hearthold. 200 people, writers, archivists, acolytes, engineers, cooks, gathered on the stone benches while the Archon explained, in the steady voice she reserved for things that could not be made better by softening, what was coming. Corin was not present. He was below, sitting with Sorvin, feeling the heartfire through his back. but he heard the Archon's voice through the stone, felt the vibration of 200 people receiving news that changed their world. There was no panic. The Vilthari were not that kind of order. They were the kind of people who had spent their lives tending a fire they did not own, and they understood what tending sometimes costs. The senior archivist, a man named Dreneth, whose knowledge of the heartfire records was exhaustive, and whose hands had not stopped shaking since the decline began, stood after Thessaly finished and asked a single question. "What do we do with the fraction he carries?" "We study it," Thessaly said. "We learn from it. We do what Ethys did, we document. We do what Morwen did, we sing. We do what Thessin did, we plant warmth where it will be found. And we hope that someday someone figures out how to make more." Dreneth nodded. He sat down and his hands were still. On the 5th and 6th days, the heartfire dimmed. The temple felt it first, the stones losing their warmth, the corridors going cold from the extremities inward, the way a body cools from the fingers and toes. The speaking stone dropped below skin temperature, and the youngest acolytes' children who had grown up on warm stone floors woke shivering. On the afternoon of the 5th, the eastern ridge fault slipped. Not a major quake, a jolt, barely strong enough to knock a cup off a shelf, but the sound was wrong. Not the sharp crack of stone breaking, but a low, sustained groan, as if the mountain were in pain. The heartfire had been holding that fault closed for 2,000 years. Now the frequency was too weak, and the stone was remembering its fractures. A runner came from Thornwall. Jessra's spring had gone dry completely. 3 families had packed their carts. Thessaly sent word, "Hold. 2 more days." On the morning of the 6th, a second tremor, stronger this time, cracked a window in the acolyte's dormitory and knocked a section of decorative stonework off the temple's eastern facade. It fell into the courtyard where Sira, the youngest acolyte, had been practicing her morning exercises. The stone shattered 6 feet from where she stood. She did not cry. She picked up the largest piece, carried it to the engineering office, and set it on the desk of the chief engineer without a word. The engineer looked at the stone, looked at the girl, and added a second brace to the Hearthold ceiling plan. Corin left the Hearthold twice those days to eat, standing at the kitchen counter, while the cooks fed him bread and broth, and pretended not to see the way his hands shook. The bond was pulling at him constantly, a low ache behind his sternum that intensified with every step away from Sorvin and eased the moment he returned. He could feel her fading, not dramatically, not a cliff edge, a tide going out, the warmth drawing back from the edges of the world, retreating toward the center, toward the last ember. On the evening of the 6th, Sorvin opened her eyes and said, "Tell me about the first flight." He told her. Not the facts she had been there, but what it had felt like. The terror and the exhilaration and the moment when the ground fell away and the bond went from a whisper to a shout, and he had understood, for the first time, what it meant to be connected to something larger than himself. "You shouted something," she said. "I don't remember." "You shouted again. We had not even landed and you were already asking for again, but it was what came after that mattered. You went quiet. You stopped shouting and you sat very still in the harness and you listened. Most riders never learn to listen. They feel the fire as warmth, a background sensation. You heard it as what it was, a voice. 317 voices all speaking at once. And you sat still, 16 years old on the back of the oldest creature in the world, and you listened. I heard you. You heard all of us. That is why you are the one." On the 7th day, Sorvin told him her true name. Not Sorvin, that was the name the Order used, the name in the records. Her true name was older. It existed before language, before writing, before the concept of naming. It was the frequency her mother had breathed onto her egg 4,000 years ago, the resonance that had cracked the shell and called the hatchling into the world. She gave it to him through the bond, not as sound but as vibration, a frequency that settled into his chest beside his own heartbeat and took up permanent residence. He felt it the way you feel a second pulse, always there, a companion rhythm that would outlast the body that had originated it. "Now you carry all of them," she said. "The 317 and me, the full chorus." The giving cost her. He felt it through the bond, the way a portion of the fire that had been sustaining her had passed with the name, as if the name were a vessel that carried its own measure of warmth. Her breathing shallowed further. The circle of light around her body contracted by a foot, the darkness edging closer. A claw mark on the ceiling that had been visible a moment ago disappeared into shadow, as if someone had closed a door on a room that had been lit for centuries. He pressed his forehead against her jaw. The scales were warm, still warm, but the warmth had a quality it had not had before. A finality. The way the last cup of coffee in a pot is warm, not less than the first, but carrying the knowledge that there will not be another. "I don't want to let go," he said. "You are not letting go. You are changing the way you hold on. The fire does not end, Corin. It changes form. I have watched it change form 317 times, and every time the fire was still fire. It simply burned in a different hearth." On the 8th day, the hearthold went dark except for the circle of light around Sorvin's body. The circle was 10 feet across. Corin sat at its center, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. Above, the temple groaned. The eastern fault had slipped twice more, and a hairline crack had appeared in the hearthold ceiling, a dark line running through the ancient clawmarks like a sentence drawn through sacred text. The engineers had braced it with timber, but timber was a human answer to a geological question, and everyone knew it. Sorvin's breathing was shallow. Each exhale carried a wisp of amber light, visible, tangible, the heartfire condensing as it cooled. "Tomorrow," she said. "I know. When the time comes, you will feel it as a tide. Let it come. Let it pass through. Do not hold on to what you see. Accept the names. Accept the names." That night, Corin did not sleep. He sat against her flank and listened to 317 names humming in his chest, and he felt the heartfire pulse through the bond, thinner now, the thread fraying, and he memorized the rhythm the way a musician memorizes a song. At some point in the deepest dark, a sound reached him from the village below. Singing. Human voices carried on the cold air through the shaft, the valley people who had learned somehow, or perhaps had always known, singing the old songs that had no words, only melody, only the shape of warmth given voice. They sang through the night, and the sound filtered down through 60 feet of stone, and Sorvin's breathing steadied slightly, and Corin understood that the heartfire was not only for dragons. It had always been shared. The humans had been carrying it too, in their songs and their stubborn refusal to leave a valley that was growing colder. The 9th day. Dawn came through the shaft in a thin, pale column winter light, stripped of the warmth that the heartfire had always added. The hearthold was cold except for the small circle around Sorvin's body, barely 6 feet across. Corin sat at its center with his hand on her jaw, his back against her neck, the bond thrumming between them like a wire pulled taut. Above, the order assembled, 200 voices on the upper terrace. The Archon speaking the Velthari farewell, the oldest text in the Order's possession, written by the first rider for the first dragon who died 3,000 years ago. The words had been spoken 317 times. This was the 318th. Sorvin's eye opened. The amber was faint now, a candle where there had been a furnace, but it found him and it held him. "Corin Vale," she said, and her voice was a whisper of vibration, barely enough to reach his bones. "Rider of the Velthari, keeper of the fire, I name you witness and vessel. What I carry I give. What I am I entrust. The heartfire passes to your keeping. Tend it well." "I will," he said. He felt the moment. Not dramatic, not a thunderclap, not a flash. A tide. The heartfire rose in Sorvin's body the way water rises in a vessel being filled from below, slowly, inevitably, with a pressure that was gentle only because it was so enormous that gentleness and force had become the same thing. It entered the bond. He gasped, not in pain, in scale. The bond, which had been a thread between them for 22 years, opened into a river, and the river carried 4,000 years of warmth and memory, and the resonance of every dragon who had ever lived. He saw them, not as images, as presences. Valandries the first, whose heartfire had been blue-white and fierce, the fire of a young species still learning what it could become. Thesmorn, who had carried the fire through the first great winter and emerged with a frequency so deep it lived in bedrock. Korath Sunkeeper, who had loved the dawn so deeply he reshaped the heartfire to amplify it. Morwen, whose singing voice was indistinguishable from the wind through mountain passes. Thessing, who had planted warmth in foundation, stones the way a gardener plants bulbs. Dralith the young, who had burned so bright in 500 years that his warmth still lived in stone. 317 lives, 317 fires, all flowing through him, each one saying the same thing: carry us forward. He did not hold on. He let them pass through, let the memories flow like water through a channel, feeling everything, keeping nothing except the names. The names stayed. They lodged in his bones, in the spaces between heartbeats, seeds planted in the only soil that would have them. The light was blinding. He closed his eyes and it made no difference. The light was inside him, pouring through the bond, illuminating the architecture of the heartfire itself, the lattice of frequencies that sustained a climate. The mathematics of how warmth becomes weather, becomes life, becomes a world worth living in. He understood it, not intellectually, but in the way his body understood breathing. And then he let the understanding pass through too, because understanding was not the same as holding, and holding was what destroyed the two who had tried. The hardest part came near the end. Sorvin's own memories, not the collective fire but her personal ones. 4,000 years of being alive. The first morning she saw snow. The sound of her brother's voice before the disease took the harmony from it. The day she watched the last dragon besides herself die and felt the frequency double and knew, with the certainty of physics, that she would be alone with it until the weight crushed her. The 22 years of Corin. His first flight. His first fall. The morning he arrived at the Hearthold with flowers he had picked from the ridge, because he thought a dragon might like flowers. And she had not had the heart to tell him that dragons cannot smell flowers, because the gesture itself had been the most beautiful thing she had encountered in 3,000 years. He let it pass through, all of it. The flowers, the grief, the snow, the brother, the loneliness, the love. He let it flow through him the way a river flows through a valley, and the valley is shaped by the river, but the river does not stay. The channeling lasted 11 hours. When it ended, the Hearthold was dark, true dark. The bond was not gone, it was changed. Where Sorvin's presence had been, there was something else. Not absence, resonance. The hum of 318 names vibrating in his chest at frequencies that human vocal cords could not produce but human bones could carry. He opened his eyes. His hands were shaking. He looked at them in the faint light filtering from the shaft and saw the first mark. A line of scales along his left forearm, following the path of the bond channel from wrist to elbow. They were bronze. They caught the thin light and held it, the way Sorvin's scales had held light, and for a moment the Hearthold was not entirely dark. He stood. His legs were unsteady. 11 hours of holding the shape of a river while 4,000 years of fire poured through him. He made himself look at her. The bronze scales had gone matte, the amber drained. The massive form settled into the stone as if the stone were reclaiming what had always been its own. She looked smaller. Not diminished, completed. As if the fire had been the last thing holding her in a shape she had outgrown, and now she could finally rest. He placed his hand on her jaw. The scales were cool. Not cold, cool, the way stone is cool in a temple that has been loved. "Thank you," he said. He became aware, slowly, of the silence. Not the silence of the dark Hearthold, something larger. The tremors had stopped. The eastern fault, which had been groaning and slipping for 4 days, had gone quiet. The channeling had released the heartfire evenly, as Sorvin had promised, not a bloom but a dispersal, a controlled release that had spread through the stone and the water table, and the air in a wave so gradual that the geology had absorbed it without fracture. The temple was intact. The valley was intact. The bracing timbers the engineers had installed were holding nothing. They had not needed to hold anything, because the fire had passed through a human body instead of through stone, and flesh is more flexible than rock, and flexibility is what prevents rupture. He climbed the pilgrim stairs for the last time. 200 steps, his legs trembling, his forearms catching the light from the shaft and throwing small bronze reflections on the walls. A new kind of heart glow, tiny, human-scaled, but real. The Archon was waiting at the top. She saw the scales, the amber ring around his irises, and she said, "The speaking stone." Corin looked. The stone, which had been cooling for days, which the acolytes had abandoned, was warm again. Not the furnace warmth of Sorvin's fire. A gentler warmth. A human warmth. The fraction of heartfire that Corin carried, radiating outward through his body into the stone, into the floor, into the temple. It was not enough to sustain the climate. Not yet. Perhaps not ever from a single carrier. But it was warm, and the temple had been so cold, and the warmth was real. Thessaly placed her hand on the stone. She held it there a long time. Her fingers spread across the worn surface, feeling the warmth the way a physician feels for a pulse, carefully, with professional attention, but also with something beyond professionalism. She had placed her hand on this stone 10,000 times across 40 years of service. She had felt it warm and warmer and steadily, terribly cooling. Now she felt it warm again, and the warmth was different, thinner, more tentative, carrying the particular signature of a human heartbeat beneath the draconic frequency, as if two instruments were playing the same note in slightly different registers. "The fire is still burning," she said. "It is. It will need tending, every day. The records say the historical conduits required proximity to stone or earth to maintain the dispersal. The heartfire needs a medium to radiate through. You will need to stay close to the temple, close to the ground." "I know. You will not fly again, not the way you used to. The fire in your chest will interfere with the harness glider's altitude responses. The physicians will want to study you. The archivists will want to interview you. The valley will want to understand what happened." "I know." She looked at him, at the scales, at the amber eyes, at the man who had walked into the hearthold as a rider and climbed out as something the order had no name for, and she said, "Then we still have work." He walked to the terrace. The order was there, 200 faces watching him emerge from the stairway, reading the changes on his body. Nobody spoke. Nobody knelt. They watched, and in their watching was recognition, not of power, not of sacrifice, of continuity. The fire was still burning and someone was tending it, and that was enough. Sierra, 14, the one who had carried the fallen stonework to the engineer's desk without a word, the first to complain about the cold and the last to leave when the tremors started, stepped forward from the crowd. She held a clay cup. Steam rose from it. "You look cold," she said. Corin took the cup. The clay was warm against his scaled palm, human warmth meeting human warmth, the oldest exchange. He drank. The tea was too sweet, the way a 14-year-old makes tea, all honey and good intentions. "Thank you," he said. The sun broke over the Ashenmere ridge. Winter light, clean and brilliant, pouring across the valley and the terrace where a man with bronze scales and amber eyes stood holding a cup of too sweet tea, while 318 names hummed in his chest, and the speaking stone warmed beneath his feet. Below in the hearthold, the stone still held the impression of a dragon's body. It would hold it for centuries, the weight of 4,000 years pressed into basalt. And if you placed your palm against the floor of that impression, you could feel a warmth that had no source and no explanation, a residual heat that the geologists would attribute to mineral composition, and that anyone who had ever loved a dragon would recognize as something else. In the valley, the singing had stopped with the dawn, but the silence that replaced it was not empty. It was the silence after a song ends, the kind that holds the music's shape, the kind that says the song is over and the song is not over, because songs do not end. They only change the throat that carries them. Later, the reports would come in. Jessra's spring had resumed, not at full volume, but steadily, as if something underground had shifted back into alignment. The aspens on the western ridge still held their gold. The fault had settled. The wind patterns, which had been drifting unpredictably for weeks, had steadied, not to their old reliability, not to the precision that 4,000 years of heartfire had maintained, but enough. Enough for the farmers to plant, enough for the sailors to navigate, enough for the valley people to stay. It was not enough. Corin knew that. One human body carrying a fraction of a fire that had been meant for hundreds could not sustain a continent. But a fraction was more than nothing, and nothing was what the bloom would have left, and the difference between a fraction and nothing is the difference between a seed and bare ground. Corin stood in the winter sun and felt the fire in his bones, small, stubborn, warm. And he made no promises and no speeches and no grand declarations. He simply did what riders do. He tended the fire, and the fire burned on.